Good morning.
Good morning.
Everyone is well? Keeping the smoke at bay? So today I'd like to continue to talk about I titled these talks Ancient and Practical Liberation. And ancient because these teachings of the six perfections are some of the oldest teachings within Buddhism that tell us about the path of the Buddha way. And practical because oftentimes when we come to spiritual teachings, we might kind of lift off into something that doesn't seem very practical. And that's just fine, actually. That's important. Oftentimes what we call practical is just our clenching really tight to material reality. But then there's a way in which spiritual practice can become a little flighty, and it doesn't really get traction in our day-to-day life. It becomes more of a kind of a break from reality as opposed to a different way of engaging reality. And so these teachings of the six perfections, or sometimes I like to call them the six liberations, these are very ancient, old, eternal, and also very practical. And again, they're about the Buddha way. They're about what would it mean to walk like a Buddha. Usually when we set a goal, which we're going to talk a little bit about goals today, when we set a goal, oftentimes our mind gets affixed to the outcome. But the outcome is completely determined by all of the steps that have been taken to arrive at whatever that outcome is. I mean, even the word outcome's a little bit suspicious, right? Like, everything's always changing, right? So that you're not going to arrive somewhere and that's just going to be some solid place. That's also going to change. There's also going to be further movement. So sometimes when we focus on the outcome as if it's a place I could go to, we mess up a little bit our intention. And we start not knowing what to do because we're trying to get somewhere we don't know how to get to. And these teachings about the Buddha way or walking the Buddha way, all of these kind of teachings are practical because they tell us about how should I think about placing my foot right here, not way down there somewhere, but right here. Where should I put my foot? You know, like literally or metaphorically. And the teachings guide us back to the immediacy of how it is that I'm living right now, because that's what the outcome is going to be about. Right? It's not something that's going to come about. You know, you go over this direction to get over there. Right? You have to head that direction to get over there. So the six perfections: generosity is the first. The second is ethics. The third is forbearance or patience. The fourth, which we're going to talk about today, is vigor. The fifth is concentration. Sometimes people translate as meditation. And the sixth is wisdom. And I just want to say, if you remember nothing else from my talk today, just do those six things. That's one of the things that's very practical about this teaching, is you don't have to start with some complicated understanding or some subtle understanding. The subtlety is not something you start with. The subtlety is something that you build by living it out. So generosity, just do that in whatever way you understand generosity to be. And we'll talk about today, do it vigorously, right? And in doing it, then something will happen. Now you're actually taking a step and you go, oh, wow, I thought that was generous, but actually, as it turns out, it was sort of self-serving. You know, you give someone a present because you really want them to adore you, you know. It's kind of generosity, but it's a little bit off, right? So you learn. You put your foot there. You thought, oh, I thought I was being generous. And I was, but I was missing it somehow. Some subtlety arises. And you say, okay, next time I do it, I'm going to do this. Next time I do it, I'm going to do it. And so you learn about the subtleties of generosity. So all of them are like that. We could say that all of them are animated by wisdom. That is the sixth of the perfections. And so as we're looking at each one of these, we're talking about the sixth perfection, wisdom, and how it is that it leads us to a more and more subtle understanding of what each of those practices are. could you maybe put that paper bag down, or it's a little bit distracting. Thank you. Yeah. So the practice of wisdom is called prajna. Prajna is the Sanskrit term for wisdom. And so all of these teachings are called wisdom teachings, or the perfection of wisdom teachings, or the liberation that comes from wisdom teachings. Prajna paramita is what that's referred to. So when we study each of them, we're studying the sixth. The sixth is animating all of them. And in these talks, I've been focusing on that wisdom in terms of clear seeing. So shifting the way that we see things, not just like literally see things, but the way we experience. To shift from not just what are we experiencing, but to how are we experiencing things? In what way? What is the way that we're receiving experience? And as we start to work with that, we can see that there's something very enlivening that emerges. Not just focused on what is the experience, but how am I experiencing? This shifting in seeing, where we're so often caught in a subject-object relationship. Whatever I'm seeing, I see the teaching stick. And the teaching stick's out there. I'm witnessing the teaching stick. That perspective is so fundamental to the way that we experience things. It has a lot of, it works for a lot of things, but it also splits us apart and creates lots of problems. So in this shifting in seeing or shifting in experiencing, we're focusing on how do we not just see things as objects of my subject, but how do we come to appreciate the simple radiance of being, which is present in all experience. That's kind of simple radiance of being is actually very practical. It's like when you experience something without it needing to become an object to your subject. There's something different happening, and you can learn to attune to that. It has outcomes in experience. Your experience changes, but you can't change it by trying to get the experience of illumination or the experience of radiance. You actually have to change the way that you're approaching something. And then that radiance, that very simple radiance of being is present. Now this shows up in our practice in something as simple as just be still for a moment. And it's almost like the universe will go, and sometimes that feels good, sometimes it doesn't feel great. But it's like we're in a spin so often. What's this, what's that? And if you just stop for a second, there's something else. I feel really lucky to have grown up in a house. My mom would say that all the time. Patrick, be still. Yeah. And probably because I was driving her nuts. You know how you are when you're a vigorous little boy. I was quite a vigorous little boy. And I remember a lot, be still. And I learned to hold myself still, just she wasn't such a domineering type mom, so it was like I didn't stay still that long. But at least it called me back to something, So it's like, oh, okay. And I kind of hold myself and then boom, go again. So this clear seeing that we're studying in I'm giving teachings in this talk, and hopefully you're taking them into your life and working with them. It's about just exploring that simple shift and how that plays out in the way that you live. That's what the liberations are about. Now, when we're working with this way of seeing, I gave 5 different lenses that we could put on, and we keep coming back to them again. These are all lenses of emptiness. So emptiness is a very core Buddhist teaching. It's usually associated with wisdom. Okay? In Sanskrit, it's called shunyata. It comes from derived from a word for like bubble. It's going to be interesting. It's like, it says all things are marked by emptiness. It means that all phenomena are like a bubble. And all that we think is not that phenomena, and all we think is that phenomena, really are just separated by this little thin layer of Dawn soap. You make that with your kids? Do you ever do that? Mm-hmm. No? and that actually what's inside and what's outside is not really divided in the way that we think it is. Oftentimes this teaching is taken as a really negative type teaching. We don't have such a good experience, a good relationship with the word emptiness. It feels very kind of bleak. But in Buddhism, it isn't really thought of as bleak. It's thought of as liberating. Not to fix on objects as being permanent or being something I could know what they are, that I could grasp, but meeting phenomena with my whole being, which is not separate from what it is that I'm meeting. So these teachings of emptiness are all calling us back to some kind of non-separate, seamless body of being, as opposed to this kind of divided, I want this side, not this side kind of way of thinking about things. So we talked a lot about impermanence of things, nothing's going to stay the same. About interbeing, that's a Thich Nhat Hanh, Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh's word for how it is that everything coexists. If one thing is present, it's only present because all of the things that are not it are participating in its presence. We talked about I'm totally involved in whatever I experience. There's no such thing as witnessing from a removed perspective. As comforting as that can feel sometimes, to be out of the washing machine. That's one student I had a number of years ago, that's the way he talked about it. He said, I feel like I'm in the front loader washing machine and I just need to get out and be able to watch it. And that is one thing to learn to do. But once you're out and you're watching it, you'll realize like, oh, I'm spinning around. Actually, there's no outside of the washing machine. Right? That is a moment of practice which can be important, where we just need some space from the chaos of life, all right? But actually, I'm totally involved in whatever it is that's happening. So that's another form of emptiness we've been studying. Also the suchness of things. That's a Buddhist term, suchness or thusness. That every phenomena is just simply what it is. Just that. And that true meeting is what's called for. And true meeting is where I am no longer the subject, I'm no longer the center of the story that is now meeting objects of my subjectness, but I am now a subject meeting a subject. I'm a person meeting a person. Whether that person is a human being, or that person is a tree, or that person is a horn beetle, whatever it is. That actually all of the phenomena that we encounter are not objects, but they're persons, they're beings. And that's a kind of the fifth flavor. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about vigor. I love that word. You can tell because I kind of smile every time I say it. And really, vigor in this teaching is not just about, the Sanskrit term is virya, and it is linguistically related to words like virility. It comes from the same root as some of our English words. And so it does on one level just have the quality of vigor, strength, commitment, discipline, focus, pouring your energy into. But in a Buddhist sense, it is always enthusiasm or vigor for virtue. It's not just simply vigor. It's not just enthusiasm for whatever you have enthusiasm for. Within Buddhism, it is seen as vigor for what is virtuous. Now, in my case, sometimes people will ask me, why did you choose Zen Buddhism? And I always say I didn't choose Zen Buddhism. I don't feel like it was a choice. I mean, I studied a lot of different things. I studied different, not only Buddhism, other things, but then also Buddhism. And then at some point, I met my teacher and became his student, and he was Zen Buddhist. That's why I'm Zen Buddhist. That's usually the story that I would tell. But if I look at, well, why did I stick with my teacher? Why did I stick with that teaching? Why did that really capture my heart in a way that some other things had captured my heart, but didn't really become my total path? And when I think about that, for me personally, I think this issue of vigor is one of the really central ones. Zen Buddhism is famous for being a disciplined and difficult path. And as a young seeker, that called to me. Because life is vigorous, and I knew that, but I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to live. I was very aware of the vigorousness of life. By the time I met my teacher, I had had cancer. I had survived that. I had been married. I had 2 children. A job. I've been trained as a school teacher, so could make enough money to eat, but didn't really know how it was all going to fit together. So I knew like shit be wild, like it's like this world is like a gaping mouth that's like chomping, right? And we're there in it. So I got that, and I like that about life. I think that's a good thing. It's challenging, but it's vigorous. And we can't really dodge the bullet. I knew that. But I didn't know what to do. And what the Zen path and the way that I met it told me was, sit down. Don't move for like an hour. Oh my gosh. Talk about take the vigorousness, take the wildness, and then just turn up the dial. That was a really good way to do it. Was like, the sit still for a couple minutes now was like sit still for this long period of time. And I was always encouraged to do that wholeheartedly. Not to try to relax out of it or kind of think that this was gonna sort of take care of all my problems, or I was gonna just chillax enough that everything would be okay. That wasn't the story. The story was, don't move, right? Now, that kind of image that comes in Zen, particularly the image of the Zen monk, of this person who has sacrificed a lot or everything in the traditional sense of a conventional life, and they've put all of their energy into the cultivation of virtue as it's defined by the tradition. That's a very compelling image. And when I was 24 and I met my teacher, I was very driven by that image. Luckily, I already had a lot of hooks in me, because I probably would have mistook what that vigorousness was about. I think most people who come to some interest in Zen practice have an energetic relationship with that image of the Zen monk. For some people, it's very compelling, and for some people, it's repulsive. And probably, if you looked closely, it will be both for you. It probably will be both. There's a part of it where it's really like, yeah, I get it. I get that, just the austerity, clarity, focus, discipline. And I feel like, yeah, I need that. But there's another part that's like, well, yeah, but what about real life? What about the shape of my life? What about the shape of myself? What about the shape of society? That becomes a big question when we see that image of vigorous cultivation of practice. We are so busy now. Do you guys understand what's going on? I don't get it. we have more stuff to do the work for us, right? We have infinitely made easier to order a burrito. Just hey Siri, burrito boy, I want the boom. I need to go and pick it up. I was like, it's so easy. Everything's easier, but we're busier. We're more frantic. We can't calm down. It's like we're in a funny place where the taking off the kind of grounding elements of day-to-day life that require effort and our capacity to shed those things, we're finding this heart which is really spinning and doesn't know what to do. And the idea that we should try harder, more effort, that's the answer, doesn't quite ring true, for me at least. We have so much effort just to keep things together. I remember when I moved back from Japan, this was one thing that really freaked me out about coming back to the US. Caveat, I don't think Japan is ideal, in the United States is not ideal. They both have lots of problems and lots of beautiful things. But they're really different. So one of the things in Japan is, like, you can just live. Like, you can rent an apartment for a couple $100. You can get a part-time job, doesn't pay a lot. Food is, there's expensive food, there's lots of expensive food, but there's also food to just eat. You go have lunch, that's $5, I mean, part of that is just a difference in economy and those kinds of things. But really, you can just kind of live. And people live in community, generally speaking. Even in the large cities, there's much more community than there is even in smaller cities here in terms of family relations, etc. And so when you're in Japan, you feel like, okay, I can live. Here, even people who are fairly successful feel like they have to make a constant effort to just keep it together, to make rent, to keep it together on the level of just making your life work, but to keep together on an emotional sense, a psychological sense, spiritual sense, too. We're in this kind of a spin, right? We're fighting really hard, and we're kind of fighting to float. Which, if you ever trained as a lifeguard, that's the easiest way to sink. Like when you're drowning people drown not because they're trying hard, and they're not trying hard enough, but you drown because you're trying in the wrong way. And you're trying really hard, but you're struggling, and then you sink. So that's why when I was a kid, I was a lifeguard for a while, and another vigorous thing. And we have to be really careful, because if you go and if you swim out to save someone who's drowning and you just grab them, you're in big trouble. So you have to find a way to engage them in which you're not just participating in their struggling. Actually, if you can relax, even people who are pretty low fat, what's that percentage of fat in your body fat content? Yeah. I float like a champ, but even the people who are like real lean, little air in your lungs and you float, right? But you're struggling. So the reason I'm really emphasizing this point is that I think one of the things that happens is people come to Zen practice, they come to the temple, and there is this austerity, there's a focus on discipline, there's a focus on enacting teachings, there's a focus on this kind of clarity, which we can see as an image of the Zen monk. For many people, that image holds that kind of feeling. But then the message we get from it is, you got to try harder, you got to try harder, you got to try harder. And that's not the message that we actually need. We need a message about effort that's different, not just effort to keep ourselves afloat. And I don't say that lightly, because I realize that the society also puts us in a position where we may have to just paddle like hell just to stay afloat. Like materially, socially, etc. So in that dynamic, there's a predictable kind of pattern of frustration where I'm trying to practice, I'm trying to put my energy into it, I'm trying to follow the teachings, trying to meditate, do all those different things, but then I fall off the wagon. I'm like, oh, well, I just don't try hard enough, it's my fault. Like that kind of becomes the pattern. And then we kind of muster up the energy to get ourselves back on the cushion. We do that, and then we're doing it for a while, and that feels pretty good, and then something happens and we're not doing it for a while, and then we start blaming ourselves again. And the message of vigorous practice can become a kind of poison. In that, it's really important for us to study. This is, like I was saying, this is the way that these 6 liberations work, is you enact one, and then you start looking for the subtlety. So some of the way that works with vigor is we throw ourselves in hard, we do the best we can, and then we realize, like, wow, there's this dynamic in me that's not working quite right. It doesn't seem liberating. It seems like problematic in some way. When we start seeing that with vigor, watch for this. What's the difference between the hero and the dominator? Almost not divided in our cultural lexicon. Almost exactly the same thing in the way that you see it portrayed in movies, the way that you just generally would think about it. The hero and the one that dominates are the same person in our collective imagination, typically. But this is not what this vigor is pointing us towards. It's not pointing us towards dominating the object, which, in the case of vigor, oftentimes is myself, right? That's not what the teaching is asking us to do, is to dominate, to just hold still. It's asking us to move forward with the best qualities of our being, to meet things with the fullness of a true meeting, including ourselves. And that line is really, really, I'm studying that constantly. Where am I just making myself do something because I want to be strong enough? I want to be whatever enough that I think it is. When am I just dominating the wholeness of my being to bring that about, as opposed to being willing to do what the hero really needs to do, which is get their ass kicked sometimes, right? Like, that's actually, a hero needs that. If you're really living out this kind of vigorous practice, it will challenge you in a way, like this very fundamental way, where I have to pay attention in a different way, not just lay out what my image of the correct thing is. And this is very confusing. I'm not saying it's simple. I'm saying that the subtlety between those two things is almost impossible to locate, right? Especially if you're a kind of person who's quite successful, or you're a kind of person who's not so successful, which is everybody. Slightly different in different ways, or successful in some things and not successful in other things. Or how could you even know if you're successful or not? It gets weird quick, right? So, but watch that one. Where's the line? Where am I just trying to dominate, and where am I actually trying to find what's a true way? My theory about at least part of the reason that we're spinning so much now is because our consciousness is turned out more than it ever has been before. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you just think about, we're sitting here in this room together, you're listening to me, you can hear my voice, you can see me, you can see people around, you can see the beautiful altar behind me. And all of those are very simple relationships in which your own presence with what you're experiencing is pretty harmonized. And it can be pretty harmonized. And as you receive the things I'm saying, you're having some feelings in relationship to that. You're having maybe some insights, maybe some objections, but you can feel a kind of depth in your own being. Like there's something that goes this direction in you, as well as goes this direction. That's how consciousness works. But when we're taking this direction and we're making it the basically organizing principle of everything we do, but it's not just about those demon boxes, although those are part of it. They're kind of a sign of something that's happening. The way we're engaging in the world, whether it's in a kind of world of the electronic things. What do we call that? People stopped saying virtual, didn't they? Did they? Virtual. Let's call it virtual. Whether that's in the virtual world, the computer world, or that's in the material world, or that's in your own mind, your psychological world, or whatever, we've got this habit of it all going one direction, and we're losing the quality of the other direction, which is very simply embedded in an older way of living, which had lots of other problems. But if I think about my chain-smoking grandma, she chain smoked. That's how she dealt with having 13 kids, and being barely 5 feet, and all of her sons being my size, and the whole thing. So I totally get it. But you could just tell when you were with her. She was cigarette and peeling the tomatoes, dropping them in the hot water, peeling potatoes, putting them in the jar. That's what would be happening right now if you went to grandma's house, right? And she was just doing that all the time, and you could tell that she had to go a lot this direction to make life work, a lot. but there was also a movement this direction. When she was peeling those tomatoes, the reason she could tell you, I was like, hey, Grandma, how do you do that? And she's like, what do you mean, how do you do it? You just take the skins off. I was like, yeah, but what's the process? She was like, it's not the process. I was like, well, I can see that you're doing a series of acts to make the peels come off the tomatoes. But if you tried to interrogate her about it, it was impossible to get any information. She was like, there is this thing you do, like tying your shoes. Does someone tell you, like, put the string over this string, and then no, you just tie your shoes. To her, that's how doing tomatoes was. Okay? I'm saying that for a reason. The reason is life's actually full of those kinds of things, almost completely unappreciated and almost completely devoid of the movement this way. And our compulsiveness is completely wrapped up in that. So if you come to more effort and it becomes a kind of more vigorous compulsion, which the world is very ready to sell you, then it won't work. The virtue won't really come from that. Now, you might buy fair trade organic coffee from a small, locally owned grower in Guatemala. Right? You may be able to accomplish that, but you will not feel better. You won't actually have shifted. You made some effort, but you made an effort towards the image of a virtue, towards the idea of a virtue, rather than virtuous living. Now, I'm not saying I buy that kind of coffee. This is really tasty, but also I think, coffee's caused a lot of problems. Right? So I'm not saying you shouldn't buy that kind of coffee. I actually prefer the Peruvian myself, but I try to buy the stuff that I think is ethical. So I'm not dissing that desire. I'm just saying that there's a whole world that's trying to sell you that as your image of virtue, and that the more effort that you make to drive the right car, buy the right food, do all those things, which people who tend to gather at Buddhist temples are caught up in that. What's the thing that the little rodent ran off?
Hamster wheel.
Hamster wheel, yeah. That kind of hamster wheel. And to just go faster on the hamster wheel, or to try harder by dedicating yourself to meditation or teachings or something like that isn't going to do it. Right? Now, all those things are good, but then what's liberating? What would be a way that we could put our energy in that direction? So if we come to this image of enthusiasm for virtue, realizing the problematic nature of just the fixed ideal of the austere monk, but realize that we may be inspired by that, but also a little repelled by it. Also realize, what does that have to do with me? And then look into what's the part of me that's just trying to dominate things as opposed to transform things. Now we can start applying these different qualities of emptiness. So maybe the first thing is, whatever you think, if we just took Zazen, for example, the practice of meditation, whatever you think Zazen is, that's not what it is. Do you have an idea like, I'm going to sit Zazen, I'm going to do this thing, it's going to be like this? It's not going to be like that. I guarantee you. It won't. Maybe for a slight moment. And then you'll wisen up. You'll say, oh, not really like that. And then if you come see a teacher and you'll say, well, I don't know why I'm thinking all the time in my meditation, I can't calm my mind, what's going on? It's like, well, whoever told you were going to have a calm mind in meditation? Right? That wasn't actually the instruction. The instruction was not to have a calm mind. Right? The instruction was to accept the mind with all of its complexity, and then to do your best to open up the way in which you're clenching down on thoughts. That's what the instruction was, not to be calm. You see the difference? So you're just dominating yourself by trying to keep everything, sit still, Patrick. Or are you actually finding your center? Are you aware that anything that you're pointing yourself towards, like say Zazen, as a practice, it involves everything. You are no more virtuous as an individual being for sitting meditation. One of my favorite stories of Suzuki Roshi, the founder of San Francisco Zen Center, was when someone asked him the question. I couldn't remember if it was a guy, a man or a woman who asked this question, but in retrospect, it had to be a man. That's the only way, I think. It's like, I'm here sitting meditation every morning, and my wife is home sleeping. What should I do? Like, he was kind of asking, like, how do I reconcile this? And the account that I read of it, Suzuki Roshi got furious. And I don't think he was like pretty calm and collected kind of person. And he said, if your wife is home sleeping, you are not sitting zazen. And what he meant by that was not like, if she's physically there, not in the zendo, then you're not sitting zazen. What he meant was, if you're sitting there thinking about your wife being home, and you don't realize the fact that she's your wife and she's sleeping is the whole reason you can be here sitting zazen, you have no idea what zazen is. Right? Like her life and your life, these are supposed to be the most intimate possible people in the universe, and you don't even realize that her being is what's allowing you to sit zazen. You have totally missed the point, totally missed the point. So if we're sitting meditation, that's only because of everyone else. And you can especially pay attention to those everyone else's that are closer to you, like, say, your wife, or your kids, or your friends, or your community, right? Or your neighbor that, does something annoying while you're sitting and you don't, weed whacking or something. Like, all of those beings are involved in whatever effort it is that we're making. No place to stand. So that third level of of emptiness. So if I'm taking my seat as a place where I'm going to nail it down and find a place of quietude, for example, oftentimes we come to meditation in that way. We think that I'm going to come and this seat of meditation is going to be where my quiet is, and I'm going to take it as the baseline. If I could just come back to this place of chill, okay, then I could go back to my life. Well, some ways that's helpful, right? You just get to recenter yourself a little bit. But actually, that seat is not separate from every other place. And so there's not really any place for you to guard yourself against the rest of the world in that seat. The effort you're making is not to make this citadel of quietude, right, in your meditation that then will have to go to deal with the world, which is all screwed up. Actually, your seat, right, is the whole world. So like if you cry during zazen, congratulations. I mean, I don't know how you can't, really. Like those places where you realize, wow, the world is a brutal place. That's important. And then this one I love. In sitting meditation, how can it be just as it is? It's almost impossible for us to regard experience within meditation as just as it is. Just as it is. Just as it is. And all of that is a truer meeting with the person which is sitting. The intimacy that we cultivate through being willing to come back to the seat again and again. That's an intimacy with this being. And that's why I'm saying I think this is a big antidote to our turned out society. Of course you're listening to the sounds, you're feeling the breeze, the sense, the gravity, maybe the aches in your body, maybe the tightnesses in your emotions or mind in some places. Right? All of those things are present. Right? But there's also this space that's right here that we call awareness, which is simply allowing. That's the place from which a lot of energy can be directed. Not just in the spinning the wheel, but towards what we know to be true. That's where I can make decisions, that's where I can make commitments, and that's where I can pull out the stops. We have a little time for some questions.
Uh-huh. I just find myself practicing deep vows of gratitude to the divine mystery, to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, because 16 years now I've been coming down the hill when I'm well enough to stand.
Yeah.
And so here I am again.
Yeah.
Just being at the very beginning of thinking about this,
Yeah.
in my mind, forbearance and vigor feel like forward and backwards. And I don't know how they play together.
Yeah. So, there's connections between all of the perfections in different ways, but sometimes the way I like to think about it is generosity and ethics are a pair. Forbearance and vigor are a pair. And meditation and wisdom are a pair. So when we're studying it in that way, that kind of pair, what we're trying to do is not let the two pull apart from each other. We're trying to let them inform each other. But oftentimes what will happen is they're kind of like parallel tracks, like a railroad track. If they touch each other, if forbearance kind of becomes vigor, or vigor kind of becomes forbearance, it's not really a track anymore. They have to stay really just side by side with each other to keep teaching about how it is that they inform each other, or we could say how they allow practice to happen. So in the case of forbearance, is this place, the way I've been emphasizing it in these talks recently, has been the continual development of the capacity to stay with what is profoundly difficult and even disorienting. So when I stay very, very present with that, one of the things I'm going to find is there's a lot of energy there. And the energy can go in different places. Its tendency is either to act outwardly as some kind of behavior, a coping mechanism, and sometimes those can be more or less skillful, right? Or inwardly. And the same way those can become those can be more or less skillful. But what we're trying to do is not to let the energy just go to where it wants to in terms of that outward or inward movement. We want it just to be there. That's what I mean by staying present with it. That we don't try to resolve that energy, which is very hard to stay, to not stuff or eject. That then becomes a basis for the practice of vigor. If we just sit there with that energy, we kind of will explode, right? In one way or another, implode or explode. We won't be able to keep it up. So we need the side of vigor that allows us to keep something moving. So in a practical sense, I would say, for example, as people start a meditation practice, at first it usually feels pretty good. It's like, wow, okay, I've been sitting, 10 minutes a day or whatever it is, and I feel like, wow, I'm settled in a different sort of way. That's great. If we keep doing it, then usually we'll start. Like I remember when I was first meditating really, really regularly, I couldn't believe how angry I could get. Like I never got that angry before. But it was like something was uncovered in me that I didn't know was there before. When we start hitting that point, everyone's constitution will be different, so it'll be different things. We start hitting that tough stuff. That's where, okay, the vigor to keep the meditation practice going is not about stamping out those feelings. It's about continuing to create the space in which those things can be present. So they're kind of cooperating with each other.
When you were talking about working with that subtle difference between dominating and meeting with your whole self, what do you look for? How do you study that? What tells you?
I say one of the really core places to look for is contraction. So that can happen on a physical level, psychological level, emotional level, spiritual level. But when you're tightening to make that move, then you're probably in a dominating control mode. I'm not saying it can never use force. Actually, the most powerful force is not constricted. Right? And this is a little tricky for us because we so much of us we've met power. You know, the way we've learned to meet power that is difficult is just to see that, you know, it's very forceful, and that's what the problem is. But actually, forcefulness is not the problem. It's the dominating quality of the forcefulness that is the issue. And the contraction and rigidity is where the domination comes from. I'm going to take whatever my image of the situation needs to be, and I'm going to imprint it. You know, and so it takes a rigidity to do that kind of imprinting. So to become more and more sensitive to that, where I'm putting the energy into something, am I finding this place of open spaciousness and balance from which the effort is coming through, or am I just ramming it through? That's what we're trying to find the difference from. And that can also happen, like, we could even look for it linguistically, for example. What kind of words am I using? Right? Am I saying, well, this is the way it is? Right? You know that term mansplaining? Yeah? Which I think we should keep, but I also think we should just have people-splaining. Like, that's sort of like, men are more, tend to be more annoying in that realm. But it's just sort of part of our whole way of engaging with the world, is a kind of explanation of how it is. And even if that explanation is very generous and very inclusive and everything, it's still doing that. Yeah. So it can get very, very subtle. Mm-hmm.
I was having a meeting with one of the sisters in Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition.
Mm-hmm.
She was asking me why I wanted to join the order of Interbeing when I had already taken the 16 Bodhisattva precepts. And I told her that I felt like I needed more support from a community that had similar values or interpretations of the precepts that I did. And she responded with, so I've been a little bit puzzled by her response. She said that there are laws and there are virtues, and at some point you have to let go to see what your virtues are. And you use the word virtue, and I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit more about where vigor meets virtue, and maybe the precariousness around that letting go.
Yeah. So let me unpack a couple things in what you said. So one thing that's very confusing in our traditions is that the translation of different words from the Chinese, in this case, into the English have landed on top of each other. So for example, the word precept, if you ask somebody in a Vinaya tradition, which Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition is, about a precept, they will understand a precept as being both a virtue and a rule or a law. And that's their understanding of precepts. Or the word that gets translated as precepts from those traditions includes both of those. In our tradition, in the Bodhisattva precepts, those Bodhisattva precepts are they're called kai. They're virtues. It's a way of talking about virtue, but they're not rules or laws. And so I'm not sure exactly what she was talking about, but it sounds like that was one of the things that she was responding to. You've received precepts, but the precepts that you received in her mind would be rules that you're required to live by to be part of the Sangha in the way that you're part of the Sangha. But that's not actually how it functions in our tradition. Our tradition actually emphasizes maybe what she was recommending, which is actually you have to let go of the rules to find the virtue. And so the Bodhisattva precepts, we still use the word precepts, that we take is about the cultivation of the virtue, in which the precept gives us a way to study the virtue, as opposed to the precept being a rule or a kind of a law. And that's a very subtle difference between those two approaches to the Buddha Dharma. There was a whole realm of ways of teaching that were and are basically practice paths, and that's a form of ethics. And there's a whole nother branch of Buddhist teachings, which is the Vinaya, which are the rules of the community. And in a lot of traditions, those two are the same thing. In our tradition, they're separated. So the path of practice in the virtue is expressed as the Bodhisattva precepts, and the rules for the community are called the pure standards for the community. And they're separate, they're a kind of separate teaching. Yeah. And I would say that's kind of a technical answer, but I would say in a general answer, I think it's one of the if I understand what you were asking and what she was responding with, this is one of the big conundrums of what it means to have a vigorous life of practice, which it's so easy, particularly when it comes to a virtue in realm of morality, for us to just grab onto, I'm good because I'm on this side of whatever that rule said. Like 5th precept, don't deal in intoxicants. Okay, I don't drink alcohol, I'm good. I do drink alcohol, but but I'm saying that's a way we could think about it. I don't drink alcohol, therefore I'm good, which is not really what this vigorousness is asking us to do. It's not asking us to just stop. I check off the box, I've done the thing I'm supposed to do and I'm good. But this is actually asking me to go to a subtler and subtler and subtler and subtler level of understanding of what that intoxication is about. And I think for we're so magnetized by the idea of becoming a saint that we sort of lock down in this way that's not exactly what this is asking us to do all the time. Okay, we probably should close. We're going to continue vigorously talking about vigor next week. And so if you have vigor-like questions, keep them vigorously enclosed until then. And I would encourage you this week, just like with all these things, just try it out a little bit. One thing, I know I said I was going to stop talking. I'll say one last thing and then I'll stop. One thing I really loved about, again, Japan's not perfect, America bad, but just something that I experienced in Japan, which I really appreciated. When you live in other cultures, that's what happens, right? You see things about those cultures that you really appreciate. You want to share it with the people back home. One is, there's just this big emphasis on being, vigorous. From when you're a little kid. You're like, oh, there's hey, straighten up. Just put yourself in. There's a shadow to that. Totally recognize there's a shadow to it. But just try that this week a little bit. If you're feeling a little don't put yourself, don't go vigorously back into the email spin, or I don't even know if people use email anymore. I do, but infrequently, if you're waiting for a reply from me. But don't just go back into the spin, but just just go, hey, I'm alive. And there's this whole world of aliveness. And so what am I going to throw myself into in this moment? And not overthink it, but just throwing yourself into what calls you in a virtuous sense in that moment. We can talk about it next week.